By all accounts, James and Polly Stepp were among the earliest white pioneers to arrive in western North Carolina. This was a dangerous and volatile time in American history. It had been less than 3 years since America declared independence from the British Empire, and now the Revolutionary War was raging throughout the country. And at the very same time, the Cherokee Indians, led by the famous chief Dragon Canoe, were carrying out bloody campaigns along the western ridges of the mighty Appalachian Mountains in an attempt to reclaim lands that had been given away during previous treaties, and more importantly, to drive out settlers who they viewed as squatters for illegally settling on native lands. Indeed, this new fledgling country was anything but united, and peace wasn't something a man just happened to find. Instead, he was forced to carve it out of the wilderness with little more than an axe and a prayer. So it was on a high, timbered hill overlooking the Green River in what we now call Henderson County, James and Polly Stepp built a small cabin that served as both a fortress and their home. And here, amidst the scent of freshly turned earth and thick mountain laurel, they began to raise a family. Now, James was a man of steady English descent and was a master of the forge and the flintlock, a highly skilled blacksmith, a man who could shape iron with his will. And as a rifleman, he could easily harvest a buck with a single practiced shot. But truth be told, it was Polly who was the true iron in the family's blood. Born of hearty Scotch-Irish stock, she was as tough a mountain woman as ever drew breath, feisty, stubborn, and possessed a will that could move mountains. Polly didn't just inhabit the frontier, she mastered it. And together, James and Polly made a perfect pair for this life on the jagged edge of the American wilderness. The forest was their provider, supplying game for the table, timber for the hearth, and a shroud of privacy that made them feel, even if for only a sweet few years, entirely invisible to the chaos of the outside world. But that invisibility was a thin veil, and it would take a tragic turn in the autumn of 1779. You see, down in the lowlands and the valleys to the east, those redcoats and the patriots were locked in a massive, grinding war that was spreading like wildfire along the Atlantic seaboard. But for James and Polly, the greater terror didn't wear a soldier's uniform. Instead, it wore war paint. The Cherokee Nation had been pushed to the brink, and they were on a desperate warpath that stretched across the rugged ridges of Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Carolinas. The wind that blew through the gaps began to carry a different kind of chill. No white family living in the deep hollers of the Appalachians were truly safe anymore. The invisible life that they had built was now being hunted. Stories began to trickle in of brutal, lightning-fast attacks where the silence of the morning was shattered by the crack of a musket and the smell of wood smoke from a burning roof, their livestock driven off and all their possessions plundered, leaving nothing behind but the cold ashes of a dream. And for James and Polly, well, those rumors were about to become a reality. It all began on a crisp morning in late September. A thick fog blanketed the forest as smoke gently curled from the cabin's chimney. Inside, Polly was busy preparing breakfast for the children. James had been gone for several days and was deep in high country on a hunting trip to stock their meat supply for their coming winter. Polly was busy as a bee, preparing a fresh cast iron skillet of cornbread over the fireplace as her 2-year-old daughter played at her feet and her 4-year-old son waited eagerly at the table for the morning's meal. But just then, there came the strangest sound from the forest. At first, it was just a single crow squawking high in an oak tree. And then there was another on the opposite side of the cabin, and then several more joined in. Within moments, the entire forest was full of the haunting sounds of crows. It was almost as if they were talking to one another. Polly knew this was a bad omen, and that hollow sound made the hair on the back of her neck stand cold. She slowly turned and looked towards that rifle that was leaning in the corner, and just then her daughter spoke.
"Mama, what's that sound? What are those birds trying to say?"
But before Polly could utter a single word, the cabin door was kicked open, and there was a Cherokee warrior standing with a tomahawk. Most women would have absolutely panicked in the moment, but Polly's Scotch-Irish blood wouldn't allow for it. Instead, she lunged with her arm, swinging out to sweep her daughter behind her skirt in one desperate motion. And then she hissed at her son in a jagged whisper, "Get under the table." The warrior surveyed the room and then stepped inside the door. He was tall, with his chest crisscrossed with the battle scars of a seasoned fighter. Polly's eyes once again darted to the rifle in the corner that James had left for her protection. But it was 6 feet away, and in the tightness of that small room, that might as well have been 6 miles. "What do you want?" Polly managed to speak in a white-hot mounting rage. But the warrior, well, he didn't answer in a tongue that she understood. Instead, he looked at her boy, cowering under the table. Then, with a sharp, guttural command, 2 more men stepped into the room and made their way towards the boy. Upon seeing this, Polly let out a terrifying cry that only a mother would understand, and she began to fight like a cornered wildcat. She grabbed a glowing, red-hot poker from the fire and swung it with a strength born of pure maternal instinct. And she connected with the first man and burned a terrible hole in his shoulder. But she was quickly overwhelmed. There were just too many, and they were too fast. A moment later, a heavy hand gripped her hair and yanked her head back with bad intentions as Polly watched her son being dragged out the door. Then another man reached for her daughter, who was huddled near the chimney. Polly let out one last scream, just as the butt of the rifle, which had been previously leaning in the corner, was smashed across her temple. Hours later, Polly's eyes flickered open. She was still laying on the cabin floor. Every breath she took felt like drawing broken glass into her lungs. And as her vision slowly cleared, she saw the devastation. The cabin had been looted and the livestock were gone. She tried to move, but her arms were heavy as lead. Instinctively, she moved her hand to the unbearable pain throbbing in her head. She had sustained several blows from a tomahawk and had been left for dead. Then a faint whimper broke the silence, and with the strength that defied the laws of nature, Polly dragged her broken body across the floor towards the fireplace. And there, huddled in the ash and shadows, was her daughter. She had been dashed against the stone wall, leaving her crumpled body like a discarded doll. Polly reached out and pulled the child to her chest. Somehow, they had both survived. But tragically, Polly would never see her son again, as he was stolen during the attack. It was there, in the midst of the tragedy, that Polly swore one day she would extract revenge, and there would be absolute hell to pay.
Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling. 5 books for the young and old alike that will make your heart smile. Click the link below to order your copy of the Appalachian Storyteller today.
Polly wore the scars of the attack for the rest of her life. And although unseen to the naked eye, she also wore the scars of the loss of her son on her heart. And despite the constant threat of Cherokee raids, James and Polly remained at their cabin on the Green River. And as the years went by, more white settlers also made their home here. By now, James and Polly realized that no militia could protect them, so they took it upon themselves to build a fort that all families could retreat to in case of attack. It was placed high on a strategic hill named Point Lookout that sloped on all sides, perfectly positioned to thwart any native attacks. All underbrush and trees had been burned away and created a clear panoramic view from all angles. The fort was surrounded by a deep trench that was full of heavy logs buried in the bottom of the trench, with their tops honed to a lethal spike. For any enemy who fell into that hole, it would be certain death. And if an intruder managed to survive the pit, they were next met with a 16-foot wall of sharpened logs that surrounded the fort. At regular intervals, steps were attached to those logs, which allowed each man to see over the top of the wall and keep a watchful eye down the hill for any approaching strangers. The only entrance to the fort was a narrow gate that had been constructed from the heart of the strongest white oak and was fortified by 2 heavy hickory bars that could withstand any battering ram. The cabin inside the fort was big enough to support the several families that lived along the Green River and was always kept full of supplies and ammunition. The cabin itself was a virtual fortress with only one door and gun barrel ports cut in all sides. It was here that the pioneer mountain folk worked together and alternated shifts to make sure there was always a few men standing guard at the fort, watching for the roving bands of Indians that moved through the area. And as fate would have it, it was the fort sitting high atop Point Lookout where Polly would extract the revenge that she had waited for nearly a decade. It all began on a crisp autumn morning in 1788. As the mountaineers climbed to their morning lookout post in the fort, several scattered plumes of black smoke could be seen on the horizon, and in the distance they saw a man staggering and hastily stumbling up the hillside towards the fort. When he finally made it, he collapsed from exhaustion at the gate. It was a white man from Bear Wallow Mountain, and with him he brought terrifying news. Nearly 200 Cherokees in full war paint had been looting fields and burning cabins, taking no prisoners in the process, and now the band of warriors were headed straight for Green River. There was no time to waste. The men quickly mounted their horses and set out to sound the alarm to all the settlers and warn of the immediate danger. Soon, every cabin within 10 miles were told to grab your muskets, your powder horns, and bullet pouches, your wife and kids, and get to Point Lookout immediately or face certain death. Within an hour, entire families, men carrying weapons, and women and children carrying food and water, began streaming up the steep, twisting trails that led to the fort. James and Polly were the last family notified to make the frantic journey to the fortress. And by the time they gathered up their children, they could already hear the whoops and the war cries from the forest. The Cherokee were right on their heels and closing in. James and Polly rode their 2 horses as hard as they could for miles through the creek beds, up and over each hill, and all the while they could hear in the distance the thunder of horses' hooves behind them. They finally made it to the base of Point Lookout, and they started up the steep climb, but their horses, well, they were completely exhausted, with their lungs heaving until their knees finally gave out, causing them to stumble and then collapse. They had no choice. They had to leave those horses behind and finish the remainder of the grueling climb on foot as fast as they could. But their children were so spent from the journey, they could no longer walk. Now seeing the torches of the natives in the distance, the mother knew that they were out of time. So Polly scooped 2 of them up while dragging a third who clung to her dress. as she forced her way up the final 200 yards to the gate of the fort. And by now, the mountaineers were positioned at the gun points, and they began opening fire on the approaching Cherokee, who were now just 100 feet behind the family. And then the warriors returned fire as a hiss that sounded like 1,000 rattlesnakes filled the air with hundreds of black-feathered arrows that darkened the sky and were now falling around James and Polly just as they dove inside of the gate. Inside the fort, it was completely packed with the smell of unwashed bodies and gunpowder. Mothers held their children to their chest as panic filled the hearts of even the bravest of men. They were certain that the natives would attack at any moment, and there were nearly 200 of them who had now completely surrounded the fort at the base of the mountain. But Polly, well, she knew all too well that the enemy wouldn't strike at night. But come morning, all hell was about to break loose. The night inside the compound hadn't been a time of rest. Instead, it was a long, suffocating vigil. The air was a thick soup of fear, combined with the sobbing of children who had finally cried themselves to sleep from exhaustion. For Polly, there would be no sleep with the other women who were huddled in the center of the cabin. Instead, she stayed awake all night, standing at a gun port along with the other men, counting down the minutes until the sun crested over the Blue Ridge. As the first morning glow peeked over Sugarloaf Mountain in the distance, the valley at the base of the hill was covered in an eerie fog, and a deafening silence washed over the forest. There was no trace of the Cherokee, and many of the men whispered that surely they had retreated during the night. Others contended that if they were going to attack, they would have already done so by now, and many of the men nodded their heads in agreement. And soon, there was talk of opening the gate and sending out a couple of men to scout the area. And just as most men were leaving their lookout positions along that wall, Polly took note of a single crow flying above the fort who was now circling. Just then, she screamed to the men to shut the gate and grab their guns. "They're coming! They're coming!" In that moment, the forest erupted in a deafening sound of crows, and from the forest line, the sky began to fill with arrows, along with the terrifying sound of the war whoops as 200 Cherokees charged the hill towards the fort. A hailstorm of arrows bombarded the sides of the fort as the mountaineers opened fire from within. Each time a man shot, he handed his weapon to the women, who exchanged it for a fresh one, and then they quickly reloaded the other. But the warriors continued their advance, strategically moving in waves on opposite sides of the structure, all while yelling blood-curdling cries. The mountaineers were on the defensive, trying to guess the natives' next move, and that's when Polly noticed one big Indian sitting atop a magnificent black horse who was yelling commands. Each time his booming voice shouted, the warriors advanced with deafening cries. He had to be the leader, so Polly tilted her gun barrel towards him and took a deep breath. And while chaos was erupting all around her, she took a careful aim and exhaled at the very same time that she squeezed the trigger. A cloud of smoke burst from her flintlock, and once the cloud of sulfur smoke cleared, the booming voice of the chief was replaced by a hollow silence as he laid motionless in the red clay. Confusion washed over the warriors, who now, without their leader, were exposed in the killing frost of the open field, where the mountaineers began overtaking them with firepower. Left with no choice, the Cherokees retreated into the forest and disappeared. The mountaineers let out a roar that shook the very foundations of their fort. Polly Stepp had looked into the eyes of the frontier's greatest terror and fired the shot that saved the people of the Green River. History is full of atrocities that were committed by all sides in the fight for America's land, both pioneers and natives. This story highlights the harsh realities of frontier life, the resilience of pioneer families, and the enduring impact of violence during a tumultuous period in American history. I'd like to remind you that as tragic as this story is, it is a true story. In fact, Polly's story was documented by Lieutenant Anthony Allaire during the Revolutionary War, in which he kept a daily diary during his regiment's march from South Carolina to Kings Mountain. Today, that diary is a valuable resource to all historians. Yet, James and Polly Stepp's life represents the very essence of the early American pioneer spirit. After the battle with the Cherokee, James and Polly would live the rest of their lives along the Green River. And during his lifetime, James also served valiantly during the Battle of Cowpens in the Revolutionary War. As for Polly, she became a legend in the hills of the western North Carolina. And even today, there are many descendants of hers who still call North Carolina home. James passed away in 1821, and 14 years later, Polly joined him on the other side of eternity. They are both laid to rest at Red Hill Stepp Cemetery in Henderson County, North Carolina. So there you go, my friends. Now you know the rest of the story of one of America's most legendary pioneers, Polly Stepp, whose story has almost been lost to the hands of time, until now. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe for more true stories from Appalachia's past.